The Book of Esther is one of two biblical books named for women. The other is the Book of Ruth. Both are extremely powerful stories of love and spirit. Whether the story is true or not does not matter. It symbolizes the indomitable spirit of a people who cannot be destroyed. We're all descendants of that people. People who have wrestled with God. We all learn the basic story as children, but it, like all other tales, has surprising parts. It, like most stories, is part fable, part history. It is a miracle story, one that predates the miracle of the Festival of Lights, Hanukkah. The names of the hero and heroine are not Hebrew. They're Babylonian. In fact, they're the Babylonian king and queen of the gods, Marduk and Ishtar. The story comes from the time of the first exile, when the learned class of Israel was taken to Babylon, which is when most of the Bible actually began to take form. The calendar is the same, many of the stories are the same, the blending of the cultures is quite fascinating. It is a story that is written by the participants themselves. And because of its call for permanent recognition, there was a rabbinic determination that everyone is obligated to listen to a live reading of the Megillah on Purim. Well, some do. Many do not. It is read in Hebrew. Some understand it. Most do not. I want you all to be able to enjoy hearing the story, which has been read for thousands of years, and I think it's okay to listen to it like this. After all, I am reading it live, and I'm reading it in English, so that you at least once get to sit back, make yourself comfortable, and hear the actual story. I have stuck to the original meanings of words as much as possible, but I have made some minor changes, and I will make some comments. There are plenty of translations available should you wish one. I do encourage everyone, however, to go and listen at some point in your life to a reading in a synagogue where the cantillation is a language unto itself. The ritual chanting of biblical Hebrew is music. It was used to help distinguish meaning and to add to the ritual. But you do not have to understand to simply sit back and listen as you would to any symphony. Except this is a symphony of words. So sit back and enjoy the whole Megillah. The word for scroll or book, and generally now considered a long, boring story. But not in this case. It is a story that has some interesting twists and fascinating characters. And see if you can find in here why we wear costumes and eat Danish instead of chocolate. And it came to pass, in the days of Achashverosh, who we will simply refer to as Xerxes from now on, the same Xerxes who ruled from Hodu to Kush, or India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces. In those days, King Xerxes established his royal throne in Shushan, the capital. In the third year of his reign, he made a feast for all his ministers and servants, the army of Persia and Media, the nobles, and all the ministers of the provinces in his service. For 180 days he displayed the glorious wealth of his kingdom and the splendorous beauty of his majesty. When these days came to an end, the king made a 7-day feast in the courtyard of his palace garden for everyone in Shushan, noblemen and commoner alike, for all were treated equally. There were hangings of white, green, and blue, held by cords of linen and purple wool to silver rods and marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a floor of alabaster and marble, arranged in patterns of rows and circles. Drinks were served in golden vessels, each of a different design. And the royal wine was in abundance, as befitting the king. The drinking was done according to the edict, without limit, because the king ordered all the stewards of his household to comply with each man's wish. Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace of the king. On the 7th day, there's that important time frame again, the 7th day. That's the second time we've seen it so far. When the king's heart was merry with wine, he ordered Mehuman, Bezita, Sharvona, Bigta, Avagata, Zaitar, and Shakars, the 7 supervisors, although it sounds a little like the 7 dwarves, who attended the king to bring Queen Vashti, wearing only the royal crown, to show her beauty to the nations and ministers, for she was indeed beautiful. Sounds like quite the party. A little X-rated, perhaps. But Queen Vashti refused to appear, and the king grew furious, and his wrath seethed within him. So the king conferred with the sages, those knowledgeable of the precedents, because it was the king's custom to confer with those who were versed in every law and statute. Those closest to him were Karshina, Shaitar, Admata, Tarshish, Meres, Barsina, and Memucan. These were the 7 ministers of Persia and Media who had access to the king and ranked highest in the kingdom. He asked them, by law, What should be done with Queen Vashti for failing to obey my order brought by the courtiers? Memucan declared before the king and the ministers, it is not against the king alone that Queen Vashti has sinned, but against all the ministers and all the nations in all the provinces of King Xerxes. For word of the queen's deed will reach all the women, and it will belittle their husbands in their eyes. For they will say, King Xerxes commanded that Queen Vashti be brought before him, yet she did not come. This very day, the noble women of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's deed will repeat it to all the king's nobles, and there will be much disgrace and anger. If it please the king, let a royal edict be issued by him, and let it be written into the law of Persia and Media, and let it not be revoked, that Queen Vashti may never again appear before King Xerxes. And let the king confer her royal title upon another woman who is better than she, and the king's decree which he shall proclaim will be heard throughout his kingdom. For it is indeed significant, and all the women will respect their husbands, noblemen and commoner alike. Amazing. It would appear, and some might say, the struggle with equality and with women's rights has hardly progressed. The idea pleased the king and the ministers, and the king did as Memucan had advised. He sent letters to all the provinces, each written in the language of the province, saying that every man shall be master in his home, and that everyone in the household should speak the language of his nation. After these events, when King Xerxes' wrath had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had happened with her. Wow, he must have tied one on if he couldn't remember. So the king's attendants advised, let beautiful virgin girls be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, and let them gather every beautiful virgin girl to Shushan, the capital, to the harem, under the charge of Haggai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women, and let their cosmetics be provided. Then let the girl who finds favor in the king's eyes become the queen in Vashti's place. The plan pleased the king, and he acted accordingly. There was a Jewish man in Shushan, the capital, whose name was Mordecai, son of Ir, son of Shemi, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been exiled from Jerusalem with those that had been exiled along with Yechoniah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had sent into exile. He had raised his cousin Hadassah, also called Esther, after her parents died. The girl was shapely and beautiful, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai adopted her as his daughter. Now when the king's order and edict became known, and many girls were gathered to Shushan, the capital, under the charge of Haggai, Esther was also taken to the palace under the eunuch's charge. The girl found favor in his eyes and won his kindness, so that he hurried to provide her with cosmetics and meals, and the 7 maids, there's that magic number again, that were to be given her from the palace. He also transferred her and her maids to the best rooms in the harem. During this entire time, Esther did not divulge her race or ancestry, for Mordecai had instructed her not to tell. Every day Mordecai would walk down in front of the harem courtyard to find out how Esther was faring, what was happening with her. Now when each girl's turn came to go to King Xerxes, after undergoing the prescribed 12-month preparation for women, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfumes and women's cosmetics, that particular girl would be provided with whatever she requested to accompany her from the harem to the palace. In the evening she would go to the king, and in the morning she would return to the second harem, under the charge of Shaazgaz, custodian of the concubines. She would not go to the king again unless the king desired her, whereupon she would be summoned by name. When the time came for Esther, daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as a daughter, to go to the king, she did not ask for a thing other than that which Haggai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women, had told her to take. And Esther found favor in the eyes of all who saw her. Esther was taken to King Xerxes to his palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tevet, in the 7th year of his reign. The Tevet would be Capricorn, or late December to early January, and it's when we celebrate that other miracle story, Hanukkah. The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won his favor and kindness more than all the other virgins, and so he placed the royal crown on her head and made her queen in Vashti's stead. Now, I wonder whether she was Esther before or after she married the king. It would be very impressive for the king to be married to Ishtar, queen of the gods. Something to think about. Then the king made a grand feast for all his ministers and servants called the Feast of Esther. And he lowered the taxes for the provinces and gave out royal gifts. And when the virgins were gathered a second time, Mordecai was appointed to sit at the king's gate. Now Esther would still not divulge her ancestry or race, as Mordecai had instructed her. Indeed, Esther followed Mordecai's instructions just as she had done while under his care. And one day, while Mordecai sat at the king's gate, Bigtan and Teresh, two of the king's supervisors from the threshold guards, became angry and planned to assassinate King Xerxes. The matter was known to Mordecai, and he informed Queen Esther. Esther then informed the king of it in Mordecai's name. The matter was investigated and found to be true, and the two were hanged on the gallows. It was then recorded in the Book of Chronicles before the king. And of course, there is a two-part Book of Chronicles, or Book of Days, which makes the final part of the Hebrew Tanakh. And it's a genealogical list. So the concept of a Book of Chronicles makes perfect sense to the people of the time, my friends. After these events, King Xerxes promoted Haman, son of Hamdata the Agagite, and advanced him. He placed his seat above all his fellow ministers. And because Haman's referred to as an Agagite, it made commentators wonder throughout the years whether there was a tie between the Amalekites, constantly referred to enemies of the Hebrews, and Haman, because the king of the Amalekites was Agag. All the king's servants at the king's gate kneeled and bowed before Haman, for so had the king commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel or bow. The king's servants at the gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Day after day they would say this to him, and he did not listen to them. So they informed Haman to see if Mordecai would stick to his guns, for he had told them he would never bow. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel or bow before him, Haman was filled with anger, but he thought it distasteful to kill only Mordecai. For once they had informed him of Mordecai's nationality, Haman sought to annihilate all the Jews, Mordecai's people, throughout Xerxes' entire kingdom. On the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Xerxes' reign, a pur, which is a lot, was cast before Haman for every day and every month. And it fell on the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Well, there you go, my friends, a reminder of when the year actually begins. And soon, of course, it will be Nisan. And Nisan, we're told in Exodus, is the first month of the year, and it is when the Feast of Unleavened Bread takes place. Well, Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is one nation scattered and dispersed among the nations throughout the provinces of your kingdom, whose laws are unlike those of any other nation, and who do not obey the laws of the king. It is not the king's interest to tolerate them. If it so please the king, let an edict be issued for their destruction, and I will pay 10,000 silver talents to the executors to be deposited in the king's treasuries." The king removed his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, son of Hamdata the Agagite, persecutor of the Jews. The king said to Haman, "The money is yours to keep, and the nation is yours to do with as you please." Well, the king's scribes were then summoned on the 13th day of the first month. And all that Haman commanded to the king's governors and to the nobles of each nation was written to each province according to its alphabet, and each nation according to its language. It was written in King Xerxes' name and sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent with couriers to all the provinces of the king to annihilate, murder, and destroy all the Jews, young and old, children and women, on one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. Copies of the edict were to be proclaimed as law in every province, declaring that everyone should be ready for war that day. The couriers hurried out with the order of the king, and the law was proclaimed in Shushan, the capital. Then the king and Haman sat down to drink, while the city of Shushan was in turmoil. Mordecai knew all that had occurred. So Mordecai tore his clothes as if in mourning and put on sackcloth and ash. He went out into the city, crying loudly and bitterly. He went up as far as the king's gate, for it was improper to enter the king's gate wearing sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the edict of the king and his law reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, crying, and wailing. Sackcloth and ash were spread out for the masses. Esther's maids and attendants came and told her about it. The queen was terrified. She sent garments with which to dress Mordecai so that he would remove his sackcloth from upon him, but he did not accept them. Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's chamberlains whom he had placed in her service, and she commanded him to go to Mordecai to find out the meaning of this and what it was about. Hathach went to Mordecai, to the city square that was in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him about all that had happened and about the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the right to destroy the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the law that was proclaimed in Shushan, calling for their annihilation, to show Esther, to tell her about it, to instruct her to go to the king, to beseech him and to plead with him on behalf of her nation. Hathach relayed the words of Mordechai to Esther. Esther told Hathach to tell Mordechai, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes to the king and enters the inner courtyard without being summoned faces execution, unless the king extends his golden scepter granting them life, and I've not been summoned to come to the king for 30 days now. They relayed Esther's words to Mordechai, and Mordechai said to go tell Esther, do not think that you will escape the fate of all the Jews by being in the king's palace, for if you will remain silent at this time, relief and salvation will come to the Jews from another source, and you and the house of your father will be lost. And who knows if it is not for just such a time that you reached this royal position. Friends, on the one hand, it almost sounds like Mordechai's threatening her, telling her that she has to act or she will die, but on the other, it begs a greater question. How do we know our fate? How do we know what our role in life may be? How do we recognize it? How can you be sure? Well, you can't, but you must not be afraid to take a chance. The story of Purim is a wonderful lead into Passover, another story of overcoming fear. Esther said to go and tell Mordechai, go and gather all the Jews who are in Shushan and fast for my sake. Do not eat and do not drink for 3 days, night and day. My maids and I shall also fast in the same way. Then I shall go to the king, though it is unlawful, and if I perish, I perish. Mordechai then left and did all that Esther had instructed him. On the 3rd day, Esther donned garments of royalty and stood in the inner courtyard of the palace facing the palace. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the palace facing the palace entrance. When the king saw Queen Esther standing in the courtyard, she found favor in his eyes. The king extended to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand, and Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. The king said to her, what is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even if it be half the kingdom, it will be granted you. Esther said, if it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the feast that I have prepared for him. The king said, tell Haman to hurry and fulfill Esther's bidding. And the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had planned. At the wine feast, the king said to Esther, what is your plea? It will be granted you. What is your request? Even if it be half the kingdom, it shall be fulfilled. Esther replied and said, my plea and my request, if I have found favor in the king's eyes, and if it please the king to grant my plea and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I shall prepare for them tomorrow, and I shall fulfill the king's bidding and reveal my desire. So she's prepared a feast, and when asked, tells them to come to another feast the next day, and that's when she'll reveal her wish. That day Haman left happy and content. But when Haman saw Mordechai at the king's gate, Mordechai neither rose nor trembled before him. Haman was filled with hate against Mordechai. Haman restrained himself and went to his house and sent for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Haman told them of his glorious wealth and his many sons, and about how the king had promoted and raised him above all the king's ministers and servants. Then Haman said, in addition, along with the king, Queen Esther invited only me to the feast that she prepared. Tomorrow also, I am invited to her feast along with the king. Yet all this is worthless to me whenever I see Mordechai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Then his wife Zeresh and all of his friends said to him, have gallows erected 50 cubits high, and tomorrow tell the king to have Mordechai hanged on it. Then you will be able to go in good spirits with the king to the feast. Haman was pleased with the idea, and he erected the gallows. That night, the king couldn't sleep, so he ordered that the Book of Records, the Chronicles, be brought to be read to him. It was found written that Mordechai had informed on Bigtan and Teresh, 2 of the king's chamberlains from the threshold guards, who had planned to assassinate King Xerxes. The king asked, what splendor and honor has been accorded to Mordechai for this? Nothing was done for him, the king's attendants replied. Who's in the courtyard? Asked the king. Just then, Haman had come to the outer courtyard of the king's chambers to tell the king to hang Mordechai on the gallows he had prepared for him. Haman standing in the courtyard, the king's attendants answered. Let him come in, said the king. Haman entered, and the king said to him, what should be done for a man whom the king wishes to honor? Now Haman said to himself, Who would the king wish to honor more than me? A little ego there, perhaps. So Haman said to the king, for a man whom the king wishes to honor, let them bring a royal garment that the king has worn, and a horse upon which the king is ridden, and upon whose head the royal crown has been placed. And let the garment and the horse be entrusted in the hands of one of the king's noble ministers, and they shall dress the man whom the king wishes to honor, and lead him on the horse throughout the city square, proclaiming before him, so is done for the man whom the king wishes to honor. Well, the king said to Haman, hurry, take the garment and the horse, just as you have said, and do just so for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not leave out a thing from all that you have suggested. Instant karma is going to get you. Can you imagine how Haman must have taken that news? So Haman took the garment and the horse and dressed Mordecai. And he led him through the city square and proclaimed before him, so is done for the man whom the king wishes to honor. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate while Haman hurried to his house, miserable, his face covered. Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends about all that had happened to him. And his wise men and his wife Zeresh told him, if this Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail over him, for you will certainly fall before him. While they were all still talking with him, the chamberlains of the king arrived, and they rushed to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. The king and Haman came to drink with Queen Esther, and again on the second day the king said to Esther during the wine feast, what is your plea, Queen Esther? It will be granted you. What is your request? Even if it be half the kingdom, it will be fulfilled. Queen Esther replied and said, if I have found favor in your eyes, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me by my plea, and the life of my people by my request. For my people and I have been sold to be annihilated, killed, and destroyed. Had we been sold as slaves and maidservants, I would have kept silent. But indeed the persecutor is not bothered by the king's loss. King Xerxes said to Queen Esther, who is this, and which one is he that has the audacity to do such a thing? A man who is a persecutor and an enemy, this evil Haman, Esther replied. And Haman shuddered in the presence of the king and the queen. The king rose in wrath and left the wine feast and went to the palace garden, while Haman stood up to beg Queen Esther for his life, for he realized that the king's hostility toward him was irrevocable. And the king returned from the palace garden to the wine feast chamber, and Haman had fallen upon the couch upon which Esther was reclining. The king said, does he even intend to have his way with the queen while I am in the palace? As soon as these words left the king's mouth, the face of Haman was covered. Then Harvona, one of the officials that attended the king, said, in addition, there's the gallows that Haman erected for Mordecai, who spoke for the king's good, standing in Haman's house, 50 cubits high. Hang him upon it, said the king. And they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's wrath subsided. Hey, be careful what you ask for. On that day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, persecutor of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told the king how he was related to her. And the king removed his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther put Mordecai in charge of Haman's estate. Esther again spoke before the king, and fell before his feet, and she cried and begged him to nullify the evil decree of Haman the Agagite, and his plot that he had plotted against the Jews. The king extended the golden scepter to Esther, and Esther rose and stood before the king. She said, if it please the king, and if I found favor before him, and the idea is proper to the king, and if I am pleasing in his eyes, let an order be issued ordering the withdrawal of the letters containing the plot of Haman, son of Hamdata the Agagite, in which he ordered the destruction of the Jews throughout the king's provinces. For how can I behold the calamity that will befall my people, and how can I behold the destruction of my race? King Xerxes said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, see, I've given Haman's estate to Esther, and he himself was hanged on the gallows for raising his hand against the Jews. Now you can issue decrees concerning the Jews as you please, in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring. For an edict written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring cannot be withdrawn. Notice, friends, the existing decree cannot be cancelled. Instead, a new one will have to be issued. Well, the king's scribes were then summoned in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on its 23rd day, and an edict was written according to all that Mordecai had instructed the Jews, the satraps, the governors, and the nobles of the provinces, from India to Ethiopia. 127 provinces, each province according to its alphabet, and to each nation according to its language, and to the Jews according to their script and language. He wrote it in King Xerxes' name and sealed it with the king's signet ring. He sent letters by couriers on horseback and riding mules, bred of mares from the king's stables, saying that the king had allowed the Jews of every city to gather and stand up for their lives, to annihilate, kill, and destroy every army of any nation or province that might attack them, including their children and women, and to plunder their possessions. On one day in all the provinces of King Xerxes, on the 13th of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Wow, that's quite a different order than what you probably thought would be issued. Why not simply issue a new order that the Jews were to be left alone? Well, copies of the edict were sent to be proclaimed as law in every province, clearly to all the nations, so that the Jews would be ready for that day to take revenge upon their enemies. Well, the miracles is most think of this holiday that the genocide was cancelled, but that does not really seem to be the case here. The couriers and the riding mules from the king's stables left urgently and hurriedly with the king's edict, and the law was proclaimed at Shushan the capital. And Mordecai left the king's presence wearing a royal garment of blue and white, large golden crown, and a shawl of fine linen and purple wool. And the city of Shushan celebrated and rejoiced. For the Jews there was light and happiness, joy and glory. And in every province and city to which the king's edict and law reached, there was happiness and joy for the Jews. A celebration of a holiday. Many of the Gentiles converted to Judaism, for fear of the Jews had fallen upon them. Fear, that great enemy of all of us, my friends. On the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, when the time for the carrying out of the king's edict and law had arrived, on the day the enemies of the Jews had thought they would dominate them, the situation was reversed. The Jews dominated their enemies. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those who sought to harm them. No man stood in their way, for fear had fallen upon all the nations. And the ministers of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's functionaries honored the Jews, for fear of Mordecai had fallen upon them. Notice how much fear keeps coming into play here. For Mordecai was prominent in the king's palace, and his fame was spreading throughout all the provinces, for Mordecai was growing in power. And the Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying. And they did with their enemies as they pleased. In Shushan the capital, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, and they killed Parshandata, Dalphon, Aspasa, and Porada, Adalia, Eridata, and Parmashta, Arisai, Aridai, and Vayezada. And the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hamdata, persecutor of the Jews, but they took none of the spoils. That day the number of killed in Shushan the capital was related to the king. The king said to Queen Esther, in Shushan the capital, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the other provinces of the king? What is your plea? It will be granted you. What is your additional request? It will be fulfilled. Esther replied, if it pleases the king, let the Jews of Shushan be allowed to do tomorrow what was lawful today, and let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows. The king ordered this done, and the law was proclaimed in Shushan. The 10 sons of Haman were hanged. Now, notice this seems to be a bit of a repetition here towards the end. They were all just killed. So the Jews of Shushan gathered again on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and killed 300 men in Shushan, but took none of the spoils. And the rest of the Jews of the king's provinces gathered and stood up for their lives to relieve themselves of their enemies, and killed 75,000 of their foes, but took none of the spoils. This is where I was always surprised by the death toll taken. They fought on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and they rested on the 14th day. They made it a day of feasting, rejoicing. And the Jews of Shushan gathered on the 13th and 14th of Adar, and rested on the 15th, and made it a day of feasting and rejoicing. Thus the village Jews who live in unwalled cities make the 14th day of the month of Adar a holiday, a day of feasting, rejoicing, and sending portions of food to one another. Now Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters to all the Jews living throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, instructing them to obligate themselves to celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, like the days upon which the Jews were relieved of their enemies, and the month which had been transformed for them from sorrow to joy, from mourning to festivity, to make them days of feasting, rejoicing, sending food portions one to another, and giving gifts to the poor. And the Jews accepted as an obligation that which they had begun to observe, and that which Mordecai had written for them. For Haman, son of Hamdata the Agagite, persecutor of all the Jews, plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and he cast a pur, which is a lot, to shatter them and destroy them. But when Esther came before the king ordered letters to be written to the effect that Haman's evil plot against the Jews be returned upon his own head, and he and his sons were hanged upon the gallows. For this did they call these days Purim, after the pur, because of all the events of this letter, which explained what happened to them and why they saw fit to establish the holiday. The Jews established and accepted upon themselves and upon their descendants and upon all who might convert to their faith to annually celebrate these 2 days in the manner described here, on their proper dates, never to be abolished. And these days are commemorated and celebrated in every generation by every family in every province and every city, and these days of Purim will never pass from among the Jews, nor shall their memory depart from their descendants. Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail and Mordecai the Jew, wrote about the enormity of all the miracles to establish the holiday with his second Purim letter. And he sent letters to all the Jews to the 127 provinces of Xerxes' kingdom, words of peace and truth, instructing them to observe these days of Purim on their proper dates, in the manner established for them by Mordecai the Jew, Queen Esther, just as they had accepted upon themselves and upon their descendants the observance of their fasts and lamentations. And the behest of Esther confirmed the observances of these Purim days, and the story was included in Scripture. King Xerxes levied a tax upon the mainland and the islands of the sea, and the entire history of his power and strength and the account of Mordecai's greatness the king had promoted are recorded in the Book of Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia. For Mordecai the Jew, leader of the Jews and loved by his many brethren, was second to King Xerxes. He sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace for all their descendants. What a great story. It is a story of karma, of fear, of faith, belief, and love. And I want to thank you, friends, for listening to the whole Megillah. Thanks.